Recently, a brand new miniseries called Masters of the Air has dropped onto Apple TV Plus, and it follows bomber pilots throughout World War II on the variety of missions that they went on, and it basically just tells their story. However, for those of you that maybe don't know this show is also made by the same people that created Band of Brothers and The Pacific, two of my favourite shows of all time, and two of the best shows ever made as well. So I thought that as Masters of the Air has recently just been released, and it kind of ties a bow on this nice little trilogy of World War II miniseries, I thought I would take this opportunity to go back and look at two of my favourite shows of all time, Band of Brothers and The Pacific. So starting off with Band of Brothers, the show primarily focuses on the 101st Airborne Division, also known as Easy Company, as they fight their way across Europe during World War II across a variety of brutal missions and campaigns, including Operation Market Garden and D-Day. Now, I can't exactly remember the first time I ever saw Band of Brothers. All I do know is that I was probably way too young of an age to have been watching it. But when I was a kid, one of my favourite subjects at school was history, specifically anything related to World War I and World War II. I just found that stuff incredibly fascinating when I was a kid. I still find it quite fascinating now, and that led to me consuming quite a lot of World War II based media at the time, whether it's video games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty, or whether it was films and TV shows like Saving Private Ryan and this. And I feel like Band of Brothers, along with those other things I just mentioned, solidified why I found that specific time period so fascinating, and it also helped me understand from a very early age what makes good TV, whether it's the writing, the cinematography, the direction, the performances. This show was one of the first times I ever watched a TV program and was genuinely just in awe of what I was seeing, because it felt like a 10-hour film. Obviously, when I was a kid, I was fixated by the battle scenes and how well they were recreated on screen, but obviously over time and having grown up and developed my own tastes in film and TV, I've come to really respect the amount of time and dedication that this show takes in telling, as truthfully as it can, the story of Easy Company and just showing what they went through in as much detail as possible, and I really commend the show for doing that. There are so many things that this show does really well, too many things that I don't even actually know where to start. I suppose the first thing I want to mention is just the way it's filmed and the way it captures the brutality of war. This series perfectly recaptured the same look and style of Saving Private Ryan, which this show and the other two shows that would later come are both executive produced by both Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg. So they wanted to capture that same sort of brutal look and feel that came from Saving Private Ryan while adding a bit more to the characters. And it definitely shows with Band of Brothers, because there are times throughout the whole 10 episodes where it feels like you're just watching an extended version of Saving Private Ryan. They perfectly recaptured that same realistic, gritty, and just brutal look and feel that that film had in terms of how it captured the battle scenes and just war in general, and it doubles down on that quite a lot throughout the series. Now, one thing that Saving Private Ryan does really well that I don't think it gets enough credit for is that you really do feel and care for the small group of soldiers that are sent to go and get Private Ryan. Even though it's restricted to a film runtime, you still end up caring for those characters in some shape or form. And that is something that Band of Brothers takes and doubles down on in the best possible way, because the benefit of Band of Brothers is the fact that it is a 10-episode miniseries, so you automatically have more time to develop these characters and write them in a way that makes them relatable, which you get a taste of in Saving Private Ryan, and again, it does a very good job of doing so within its film runtime. However, Band of Brothers takes that and just expands upon it in the best possible way, to the point where you genuinely feel like a member of Easy Company by the time the show has finished. And I think one of the ways Band of Brothers really succeeds in doing this is by giving all of these characters just the right amount of time. There are a lot of people in Easy Company, yet it knows just the right times and when to focus on specific people. The majority of the series is focused on Winters and Nixon. However, there are specific episodes dedicated to specific soldiers that are noteworthy in some shape or form. For example, there is an entire episode dedicated to a soldier called Blythe, who is kind of experiencing shell shock and at times feels very out of the moment and doesn't really get involved in the fighting. However, he gradually builds up the courage to get involved more as the episode goes on. And it's the fact that the show takes the time to do that for specific people, I think, is a really nice touch. And again, makes you fully understand the camaraderie and the group mentality of Easy Company just so much better by the time the show is finished. And that's another thing the show really does that I think it really benefits from, is the fact that the start of each episode is an interview with the actual soldiers of Easy Company, which again adds much needed context and gravitas to the events you're about to see unfold in said episode. What really helps this show in terms of getting you to care for these characters, alongside the interviews and alongside the fact that they dedicate specific episodes to certain soldiers, is the fact that this show tells their story kind of right from the beginning to right till the end. The first episode fully just focuses on them in training, and you see how brutal their colonel was, played brilliantly by David Schwimmer, and how they started there, how they go through God knows what during the actual war itself, and then ending with a somewhat positive note on the final episode where the war is finally over and they finally get to relax in some shape or form. And seeing them go through that entire journey feels very cathartic, but also feels like I said earlier, that you almost feel like another member of Easy Company. You've spent all this time with these characters going through hell and back, and you feel like you've gone through that experience as well. And that is one of the many reasons why Band of Brothers still holds up after all these years. It came out in 2001, for crying out loud, and it still holds up in so many ways. And then that leads us on to the Pacific, which I always feel bad about because I genuinely feel like this show gets forgotten about half the time. I never forget about it because the Pacific had just as much of an impact on me as Band of Brothers did. And honestly, there are times where I can't choose a favourite. On one day I might prefer Band of Brothers, and on another day I might prefer the Pacific. It depends really what mood I'm in. And honestly, I think both shows work for completely different reasons. And I think that's why the Pacific didn't necessarily get the same sort of reaction and audience that Band of Brothers did when it was released, because it was going for something slightly different that people weren't ready for. And I think having people revisit the Pacific with the lead up to Masters of the Air has helped kind of a general reassessment of the Pacific, which I think has been a long time overdue, because I've always loved the show but have always understood that it was going for something different, whereas everyone else has started to gradually understand that, like, oh, it's not trying to be like Band of Brothers, it's going for something different, and I can understand that and appreciate that on its own. So whereas Band of Brothers focused on a core group of characters and stuck with them for the entire time, the Pacific goes for a different approach. Because the Pacific battlefield was so vast and 10 times more brutal than the European battlefield ever was, what they decided to do with the Pacific is tell 3 separate stories that are never interlinked. The 3 soldiers you're shown the perspective of in the Pacific are John Basilone, Eugene Sledge, and Robert Leckie. Now, each of their individual stories are quite fascinating for reasons that you get into the more their stories unfold. However, I feel like one of the show's main issues, and I've seen multiple people bring this up, and it's one thing that does halt the show slightly in terms of its quality, only slightly, is the fact that because you have these three separate characters all doing their own separate things, and because the show is trying to give them all just the right amount of screen time throughout 10 episodes again, is that you never get to fully connect and care for these characters in the same way you did with Easy Company in Band of Brothers, because you're with those characters for the whole of the 10 episode run. Whereas with the Pacific, 1 minute you're with John Basilone, 1 minute you're with Eugene Sledge, then it bounces back to John Basilone, oh, and now we're with Robert Leckie, and it can be a bit messy at times. And I feel like the best way to watch this show is just focus on the positives of each of their stories. For example, the most compelling of the three stories for me anyway was that of Eugene Sledge, because one, we do spend a little bit more time with him than we do the other two in a few specific episodes, but also when we start the series, he is very much this brand new recruit who's very wide-eyed and doesn't know what to expect, and then by the time you get to the end of the series, he's a completely different person and is changed possibly for the worst. And that is where the main difference between this and Band of Brothers starts to show itself. Whereas Band of Brothers tells its story in a fairly typical war movie sense, where like you have these soldiers going through what they've gone through, but there is always a little bit of hopefulness in there somewhere. The Pacific, and again, this goes primarily down to the fact that this battlefield during World War II was a completely different beast compared to the European battlefield. It was 10 times more brutal, it was incredibly unforgiving, and was just downright relentless at times. And that's what the Pacific is going for. It's trying to tell that whilst also delving into a darker side of these characters' lives that we never really saw, only in a few places throughout Band of Brothers. Like the lengths that these characters go to, especially Eugene Sledge throughout his story, can be really unsettling to watch at times. The Pacific instead just shows how unforgiving war can be and how much of a toll it can take on specific people. You get that a lot with Eugene Sledge's story, you get that quite a bit with Robert Leckie's story as well, and then you get John Basilone's story, which you think has a bit of hopefulness in it, but then by the time that storyline ends, it just kind of rips the rug from under you and just kind of proves again how bleak and unforgiving war can be. On top of all of that, again, the battle scenes are brilliantly well realised in the Pacific. Personally, I think they're slightly better than Band of Brothers and even Saving Private Ryan to an extent. I know they're going for slightly different things because, again, they're two different types of battlefields, so they're going to look different on the screen. But in terms of fully realising the scale of the Pacific War, but also realising, again, how bloody and brutal that battlefield was, the Pacific does that so well. And I can completely understand the fact that this was, at the time of its release, the most expensive TV show ever made. Also, a little bit of personal preference here. I kind of prefer the score for the Pacific over Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers has a fantastic score by Michael Kamen, but the Pacific has Hans Zimmer. And personally, I think the main theme to the Pacific is a bit more memorable and just kind of hits an emotional chord a bit more effectively than Band of Brothers does. Again, Band of Brothers' score works well for what it's trying to do, and I'm not trying to crap all over that, but personally, I've always had a bit more of a preference for the score for the Pacific. I'm so happy that I've finally had the chance to talk about these two fantastic TV shows on my channel. If you've seen either the Pacific or Band of Brothers, let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to have a discussion of some kind in the comments, just gushing about how great these shows are. And if you've seen Masters of the Air, please let me know what your thoughts are on that. I will eventually get around to watching it, and I might do a video on it when I do watch the show. But yeah, if you like the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.